Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joshua Daniels, and I am an historian and filmmaker based in Rotherham, Yorkshire. Although my main area of research is in the history of journalism, I have a big love for architectural history too, especially Georgian architecture and those situated in Yorkshire. Although my main area of research recently has been on Wentworth Woodhouse, I'm conducting other research onto other Georgian buildings in Yorkshire, such as Castle Howard and Sewerby Hall. One aim of my talk is to uncover the secrets of Wentworth Woodhouse's history. I've done a lot of research on this historic home, and some of it has uncovered that it actually dates back way before any of us realised. Furthermore, I really want to dispel any myth that historic homes and their owners were all just living in their own bubble, as the family here at Wentworth Woodhouse were very kind and very interactive with their local community. I'm taking you all now to a very favourite place of mine, Wentworth. It's a really quaint, picturesque, very typical English village, with no more than about 1,500 people living here. Nice pub too. But this small village has one huge story and one huge building, and it doesn't get much bigger than Wentworth Woodhouse. This Georgian giant is Wentworth Woodhouse, and aside from being my favourite historical site in the world, it's also the largest private residence in all of the UK. The front of this house is twice the size of Buckingham Palace's front, at over 600 feet long. There's nearly enough rooms in there for every day of the year, and it cost around £80,000 to build at the time, which is about 9.3 million in today's money. It's a truly magnificent building and a staggering feat of architecture. Its history holds many secrets, tragedies, triumphs, and of course, some of the greatest and most interesting Georgian figureheads in the country. My granddad first took me to visit here. It's one of his favourite places in the world too. When we arrived, I looked at it and went, "It's massive, Grandad." He turned to me smiling and said, "Josh, they're just the stables." So we continued down the path, and my word, when I first laid eyes on this, my jaw just dropped to the floor. Ever since then, when I was about 9, that feeling of awe at this marvelous mansion and other buildings like it have never really left me. I've always felt curious and amazed by buildings, and as I've grown older, I've realized that a lot of those are Georgian buildings. And the fascinating figures that built them have always played an important role in the country, and also really intrigued me as to how they got their money, who they were, what they did with it, and why they ended up building such huge houses. But I'm always finding myself with big questions going unanswered, usually by other research. Why are these big buildings where they are? Who built them? And in the case of Wentworth Woodhouse, why is it so chuffing big? So I set out to try and answer these questions myself using some research from different archives that others have simply just not gone into yet. To discover the secrets of this Wentworth Woodhouse, my research has taken me back over 1,000 years ago. We start our journey in the Anglo-Saxon period. This answers the question, why is the largest private residence in the UK in a tiny village in Yorkshire? Well, the original house that the Woodhouse is built on was on land given to the canons of Bolton Abbey by one of the landowners at the time. A certain William Wentworth Woodhouse existed in the 1300s who owned this land, showing he was the one who started developing the house that would become the marvellous building that stands today. According to the Domesday Survey, it was originally called Winterworth. Since Worth roughly meant house and winter roughly meant, well, winter, it is fair to say that we know Wentworth was originally called Winterhouse. It later named the name Wentworth, which roughly meant fair house or white house. The first one to bear this name was Reginald de Wentworth, who was from a family so prominent that he actually gave their name to the village and not vice versa. As for the house, however, it actually belonged to a family called the Woodhouses, who lived in Wentworth as well. They began with a man named Yolsey Woodhouse, born around 1075. He first had a much smaller house, mind you, but still a house built in Wentworth, which is the very original place where the Wentworth Woodhouse was situated, as it was built on the land that the canons of Bolton Abbey gave to them. This, over the years, was built and rebuilt until it became Wentworth Woodhouse as we know it today. The name Woodhouse typically means a house made in a clearing of forests, although it also means a house made of wood, which is more than likely where the name Woodhouse originally came from. This house was originally built out of wood before being built out of stone. However, it was not until 1250 that the mansion get its iconic name, answering another big question: why is it called Wentworth Woodhouse? Robert Wentworth was a descendant of Reginald Wentworth, and Emma Woodhouse was a descendant of Yolsey Woodhouse. They married in 1250 and thus inherited the house that was there. To celebrate their marriage, they named their new estate Wentworth Woodhouse. So the name dates back over 750 years on a house that existed over 900 years ago on land given to the landowners by the canons of Bolton Abbey in the Anglo-Saxon period. However, the Wentworth family's desire for greatness began when it landed in the hands of a certain Thomas Wentworth, the 11th great-grandson of Robert Wentworth. He is more commonly known as the first Earl of Strafford. The name Strafford comes from the term Strafford, which was the administrative division Wentworth Woodhouse belonged to. The Earl of Strafford was born in 1593 and a major figure leading up to the English Civil War. He was an MP for Yorkshire and later Deputy of Ireland. He was an avid supporter of King Charles I leading up to the English Civil War, despite early on in his career being quite critical, or at least on the fence, about who he gave his support to, either Parliament or the Crown. Ultimately, however, he was devoted to the Crown nearly before his death, as was the King devoted to him. Tensions were brewing between Crown and Parliament in the mid-1600s. Parliament were worried about the King's power, and the King was worried about losing his status. Charles simply could not afford to go without Parliament, however, and after 11 years without him in 1640, had to call them back into session. The first item on Parliament's agenda was to execute Strafford. He was accused of tyranny in Ireland and had very little support in the House of Lords. Charles I stalled the order of execution, for he did not want to behead his friend and trusted advisor. Yet the calls for his execution grew stronger and stronger. Mobs crowded the palace, threatening the Queen and her child. Parliament was growing weary. The writing was on the wall for Strafford. In 1641, Charles reluctantly signed his death warrant in an attempt to appease Parliament. On the 12th of May, 1641, Strafford was beheaded. Not a year later, though, the English Civil War was already declared. It seems Strafford's death was, arguably, in vain. Whilst there were no real recordings of what Strafford's house actually truly looked like, we do know it was sizable with 64 residents, including servants. The two oldest parts of the house are the Long Gallery and the Well Gate. This is the Long Gallery you're looking at now. The Long Gallery is, as you guessed it, a rather long room, and as you can also see, a really beautiful one too. Long galleries were common in Jacobean architecture, which is what this house used to be styled in. Jacobean architecture was a style that originated during the early 1600s, and its name is derived from Jacobus, Latin for James, not Jacob, who was king at the time, of course, King James I. Around the back of the house is the Well Gate, so called because it used to lead to an entrance to a court which contained a well, surprisingly. It now leads into the chapel courtyard. The house that Strafford built is not the absolute mammoth of a mansion that we know and love today, however. No, the origins of the building that we know and love today begin in, of course, the Georgian period. In 1724, to be precise. And weirdly, it all began with the Family Feud. Strafford's only surviving son, William Wentworth, obtained his wealth through landowning, and much like his dad, was a politician, including being Knight of the Garter and being granted the title of second Earl of Strafford. Upon his death, William had no surviving children or brothers. Naturally, it would be the logical decision to pass the vast estates on he owned to his surviving cousin, right? Well, apparently not to William. He requested that upon his death, his incredulous inheritance was to be passed to his nephew, Thomas Watson. Was this to help set up Thomas Watson for life? Was this to purposely annoy his cousin? Was it just for a bit of family drama? We don't actually really know. All we do know is it really did actually annoy his cousin. The cousin in question was a certain Thomas Wentworth, who was also a great nephew of the first Earl of Strafford, who was also called Thomas Wentworth. To make things more confusing for us, this cousin was also called the first Earl of Strafford. So yeah, the great nephew of Thomas Wentworth, the first Earl of Strafford, was also called Thomas Wentworth, the first Earl of Strafford. I'm not even kidding. You'll find that the families of Wentworth Woodhouse, as fascinating as they were, didn't really have much creativity when it came to naming their children. So, Thomas Wentworth truly believed that Wentworth Woodhouse and all the land that came with it here were his birthright. And truthfully, why wouldn't he be bitter? He was honestly a logical choice for the rightful heir. And he lost out on a lot of wealth, land, and status. I think we all would be bitter if we lost out on that. Nonetheless, what transpired next was nothing short of just straight up rich guys showing off. Disputes often lead to conflicts, whether physical, political, or financial. This dispute, however, is quite unique. To try and outdo each other and to try and outdo his cousin's nephew, Thomas Wentworth began a war of architecture. In an attempt to rival the Woodhouse, another building called Wentworth Castle was commissioned by Thomas. Originally called Stainborough, Wentworth Castle is another fantastic piece of Georgian architecture. The original house of Stainborough was built around the 1560s before being rebuilt and sold to Thomas Wentworth by the Cutler family in 1708. In order to compete with his cousin, Thomas Wentworth built upon this house and made it into Wentworth Castle by 1727. It was designed with the utmost objective of outshining the family that owned Wentworth Woodhouse, as they felt wronged by being left out of the inheritance. This is where the colossal Woodhouse gets its origins. Much like how Wentworth Castle was built to show off wealth and status, so too was Wentworth Woodhouse. However, we are about to find out the answer to a question I asked myself as a kid. Why is it so big? The beautiful brick-built behemoth beast that we know today actually originates from 1724. Commissioned by Thomas Watson Wentworth, the first Marquess of Rockingham and a prominent Yorkshire politician and landowner, he was determined to outshine his cousin, determined to impress his political allies, and determined to showcase his status. So the first Marquess began building his family home, which, as a lot of people say, is actually two houses, or even three, one built at the front, one built at the back. Colloquially, and rather comically, known as the back front, it was the west side of the house that was built first. The west front, as it's also known, is at the rear of the house today and leads onto the gardens. It was initially designed by multiple architects. Ralph Tunnicliffe, for example, who worked on Wortley Hall, was called in to tackle the daunting task of devising how the Wentworth family home should look. The new style was built in Baroque style. Baroque was a European style of architecture that flourished from the late 1600s to the early 1700s and was adopted for other notable buildings such as St. Paul's Cathedral, as well as the west-facing part of the Woodhouse. Here you can feel especially intimate with the family that lived here, as the west front is where the family made their living quarters. It remained the living space of the residing families for over 350 years, until the connection with the historic house ended. At the time, however, no one was truly happy with the west front. The party that the Marquess belonged to, the Whigs, saw Baroque as rather distasteful. Thomas himself also felt that it was not grandiose enough for his reputation. Thus, he ordered that construction should begin on an expansion of his family abode. Under the guidance of the architect Henry Flitcroft, work began on constructing the east front, the most iconic side, and now the visitor entrance of the Woodhouse. Flitcroft became a renowned craftsman, with his work ranging from the Virginia Water Lake to Wimpole Hall. He modelled the new building in Palladian style. This style was named after the Venetian architect Andrea Palladio. It gained huge popularity as a design in Britain after the English Civil War. The Marquess's desire to be fashionable may have been one reason why this style of architecture was chosen. Influenced by Greece and Rome, trademarks of Palladian style are still evident in the Woodhouse, such as the large Corinthian pillars to the entrance of the house that you can see there. The style is very classic Georgian architecture, almost perfect symmetry, and 3 layers of windows. The sign above the portico over there reads Mia Gloria Fides, meaning faith is my glory, which was the Rockingham family motto. The Marquess was so fixated with the title Rockingham, possibly to distance himself from the Family Feud, but also because it was a very noble and very unique title. It comes from Rockingham Castle, as the first Marquess was a direct descendant of the owners of the castle, and thus they passed on the title of owners of Rockingham down to him, as well as he also inherited the titles and estates from the Wentworth Woodhouse lineage too. The first Marquess also changed the name of Wentworth Woodhouse during his stint there to just Wentworth House, possibly to distance himself from the Wentworth family feud, and to also call it that this is the House of Wentworth, to really stick it to his cousin. The first Marquess died of apparently drinking himself to death in 1750, as Robert Walpole described him as drowning in claret, which was a French wine. His vast estates were passed to his son, Charles Watson Wentworth, the second Marquess Rockingham. Born in 1730, Charles Watson Wentworth was the first Prime Minister from Yorkshire. He essentially created his own political party, known as the Rockingham Whigs. He was also very popular with America, having supported their right to taxation with representation, and thus the city of Rockingham in North Carolina was named after him. A renowned gambler, however, the famous St. Leger races in Doncaster were also newly named the Rockingham Stakes in his honour, and he owned the first horse to ever win the St. Leger races. Most of the building of Wentworth Woodhouse took place under the ownership of Thomas Watson Wentworth, the first Marquess. Let's take a look inside to see just how grand the interior is, to match the grand nature of the exterior. Today, the first room you enter is the Pillared Hall, designed by famous York architect John Carr, who was one of the most renowned architects of the 18th century. The pillars are a Palladian style again, and are built simply just to support the giant room above it, as this was not actually the entrance originally. It has remained unaltered mostly, apart from in 1904, when electricity was being installed into the house, and an electrician smelled gas. Thus, in his infinite wisdom, decided to search for the source of the gas with an open flame. As you can expect, things ended with a bit of a bang. Luckily, the ensuing explosion only singed his hair and didn't really cause any damage to the room. Moving towards the end of the pillared hall is the fabulous grand staircase, erected in 1770. The main feature of the hall is this fascinating and beautiful statue, the statue of Ceres, the Roman goddess of fertility, who was recovered from an expedition to Herculaneum, the town that was also buried in the Mount Vesuvius explosion of 79 AD, along with Pompeii. The statue is actually being forbidden from being moved and is estimated to be worth more than the house itself. Moving up the staircase, you are about to enter what has been described as the finest Georgian room of all England, and I'm really inclined to agree. This is the jaw-dropping marble saloon. It's a 40-foot high, very echoey, beautiful delight, and it's one of the best features of the already magnificent house. This is where a lot of guests would have been entertained, and a lot of parties would have taken place, etc. I'm going to let you in on a not so well kept secret, however. Whilst the floors are actually made of marble, the pillars are actually made of scagliola, an imitation marble made of plaster. Don't let this put you off, however. This room is not only very beautiful, as you can see, but has also played host to some very influential and unexpected guests, including King George V, Benjamin Franklin, and Anna Pavlova, a famous Russian ballet dancer. Down the corridor is another most notable and very famous room, the Whistle Jacket Room. This beautiful room gets its name from the very striking portrait of the horse you can see over there. This horse is known as Whistle Jacket, which in turn gets its name from a remedy for a type of cold that created a whistling cough, a remedy made of black syrup and gin. The horse in question was one of Charles's race horses and gets its own room because it was, well, a big moneymaker. I mean, in 1759, for example, he won Charles 2,000 guineas, which in today's money is about £204,000. This portrait of Whistle Jacket is actually a replica. The original was painted by George Stubbs, and the original was bought for £11 million by the National Gallery. Moving out of the house, there are the absolutely stunning gardens outside the west front. These were once the home to the lavish garden parties that once took place here. They are also home to the Camellia House and the menagerie that also lived here long ago. The Camellia House, built in the mid-1700s, is so called because of the camellia flowers, imported from China and Japan, and are some of the oldest in the world. There were theories that these were used for tea, as tea was a big part of Wentworth Woodhouse's community. However, some of them may have been simply decorative. Then there was also the menagerie, built in around the 1730s, which housed some extraordinary creatures, including a moose, some buffalo, two of which escaped at one point, a golden eagle, and an orangutan. This orangutan was originally fed a not very nutritional diet of wine and biscuits. One of the most other prominent buildings on the estate are the stables, and the first buildings that you see when you drive down the path to Wentworth Woodhouse, and the first things that I saw back when I was 9. Built by 1782, these were the biggest in the country at the time, as they could house 84 horses. This was because, as I mentioned earlier, Charles Watson Wentworth, whilst being a prominent Yorkshire politician, had one vice, which was gambling. He had a love of racehorses. These stables were constructed in the same year Charles Watson Wentworth died, however, and thus he could not really utilise or appreciate the massive stables he had built. The nearby Wentworth Garden Centre was also used by the family, as they were used as the kitchen gardens. In the estates behind the west front, there is also the mulberry tree, a type of tree introduced to Britain by James I, who insisted landed aristocracy plant seeds of this in their gardens. This mulberry tree here at Wentworth Woodhouse is thought to be one of the oldest in the estate, at around 400 years old. But the most famous buildings, aside from the Woodhouse that the Watson Wentworths had built, were of course the follies of the estate. Now, follies are some of my favourite types of architecture. I absolutely love them. I find them so interesting, and I always think they always are so unique and so beautiful, and also have such amazing stories to tell. There are absolutely loads of them in Yorkshire too, including the tallest in the world, Wentworth Tower in Halifax, Leeds. I'm also doing research on some follies in Yorkshire too. Follies were very popular in France and England during the Georgian period. Follies were usually built just to showcase the owner's wealth or status, and like most Georgian architecture, took inspiration from classical styles such as ancient Greek, Roman, or Egyptian. The first folly built on the Wentworth estate is the 46-foot tall Needle's Eye. There is a local legend that this was built as a wager, that the gambler, Charles Watson Wentworth, bet he could drive a horse through the eye of a needle, and, to follow up on this bet, had this folly built in order to win that wager. I hate to be a party pooper, but that's simply not true. This legend may have developed after the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam drove a gun carriage through it in the early 1900s. Built before 1730 by Thomas Watson Wentworth, it was so called because it looked like the head of a needle and was originally called the Needle. Instead of the urn on top, it actually had a coronet, which was a small crown usually worn by earls. By 1846, the archway had been added, and it got its name Needle's Eye over 100 years after being built. By 1857, after the 5th Earl Fitzwilliam's death, the coronet on top had been replaced with an urn to show that this had been dedicated to him as a memorial. There are holes in the eastern side that are purportedly from musket balls from an execution, possibly of Jacobite rebellions. Thomas Watson Wentworth, owner of the Woodhouse at the time when this was being built, was also Lord Lieutenant of the West Riding of Yorkshire. In this position, he fought for the government against the Jacobites in the 1745 rebellion. The Jacobites were a group of supporters who believed that in the restoration of the House of Stuart to the throne following the Glorious Revolution of 1689, which led to a constitutional monarchy. The Jacobites led a series of uprisings from 1689 until they ended in 1746. The final rebellion lasted from August 1745 until around April 1746. The Watson Wentworth family had serious involvement in the defeat of the Jacobites here. Even Charles Watson Wentworth ran away at just 15 years old and joined the Duke of Cumberland's army to fight against them. To thank Thomas for backing the monarchy, George II raised Thomas's status from Earl to Marquess of Rockingham. In the ranking of peerage in Great Britain, Marquess is only one step below Duke, which is the highest rank below monarchy. The next folly is the Ionic Temple, situated in the gardens, and it had been built by 1735. Inside the temple, which actually wasn't used for any religious purposes, is a statue of Hercules, as you can see him there, pertaining to the Greek architectural influences of follies in general, but also at Wentworth Estates and Wentworth Woodhouse. Then there is the Doric Temple, much less famous and not accessible. This is built by 1745, surrounded by a land sculpted by the famous Sir Humphrey Repton in the late 1700s. The difference in Doric and Ionic, both Greek styles, is evident in the columns, and the prominent three styles are all present here at Wentworth Woodhouse. Because I'm a bit sad, one thing I like to do is try and identify the style of columns wherever I go to a historic house like Wentworth Woodhouse. And as you can see there, Doric is quite unique insofar that it has the engravings on the side, but it's usually quite plain at top. Ionic is the very classic and very iconic and arguably most famous of the style, with what look like scrolls. You might have seen those in things such as Disney's Hercules. That's where I recognize them from. And Corinthian is rather elaborate and is one of the most unique and very detailed looks of the columns. The next folly up was the 100-foot tall Hoovers Stand. As someone who's been up there, let me tell you, it's a fair few steps, but the view of the surrounding area is fantastic. In fact, there was a myth at one time that you could see York Minster all the way up there. Now, of course, with more light pollution and air pollution nowadays, you really can't see it. But you could seriously doubt whether you could see York Minster at the time before any of the Industrial Revolution. Built by 1748, it gets its name from the hamlet it is situated in, Hoover, and a stand, which was an ancient term for a place to observe a hunt. It was built after the victory against the Jacobites, but it was really a celebration of Thomas Watson Wentworth and his elevation to the status of Marquess. Whilst it is claimed that this folly was built to commemorate the victory, I argue that it was really built to commemorate that he had become the Marquess, because after all, it was a very unique and noble title, as I said, and he was very proud of that historic connection. Despite this folly's great height and being on one of the tallest hills in all of Rotherham, the next folly built was even taller. This is Keppels Column. It took 7 years to build and was the only folly built by Charles Watson Wentworth. It is the tallest folly in South Yorkshire at 115 feet tall and is dedicated to Admiral Augustus Keppel. Keppel was a Royal Navy officer who narrowly escaped a court-martial after his poor leadership in the First Battle of Ushant, 1778, during the American Revolutionary War. Keppel and Charles were political allies, and thus he took his political victory as a personal one too, and dedicated this column to the victory of the Whigs. It was meant to be bigger and with a statue on top, which is why the middle of the column bulges. This is an effect known as entasis, which is used to make columns look straight from afar. Sadly, money ran out, and thus the column could not be built to the original 175 feet intended size. However, the entasis bulge had already been added, which gives it its odd but I think rather unique and rather striking bulging appearance. On October the 1st, 1780, Keppel's Column was unveiled to the public. Keppel, Charles, and Charles's nephew, the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam, all stood on the viewing platform that was situated on top of Keppel's Column, in front of a roaring crowd. Although it was a grueling 220 steps up to the top, Keppel's Column was actually prescribed as a medicine in later years by local doctors, not just for the exercise, but also for the fresh air at the top. Although closed in the 1960s for being unsafe, it's great to know that it's being restored and renovated and to be reopened once again for the local community to enjoy. I'm also going to be one of the tours and local experts for when it reopens. The 4th Earl Fitzwilliam, as we just mentioned, was the nephew of Charles Watson Wentworth and is one of the most prominent figures in Wentworth Woodhouse's history and in Georgian history in Yorkshire. Charles Watson Wentworth married Mary Bright, but alas, when Charles died in 1782, he died childless. Thus, his vast estates were passed to his nephew, the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam. To show his devotion to his uncle, the 4th Earl built one of the last follies on the estates, the Rockingham Mausoleum. Construction began in around 1785. It took about 6 years to build, but the 4 obelisks, you can only see 3 of them on this picture, but the other one is in the other corner of there, were actually built much earlier. These were completed by about 1726 and used to be situated around the Woodhouse, around the west front, for example. In 1792, they were moved to the 4 corners of the mausoleum where they still stand today. The next year after that, in 1793, the 743 iron railings, which were contributed by Rotherham-based iron founders Samuel Walker and Company, were erected as a protection against vandals. Samuel Walker and their iron founders were hugely influential and hugely important to Rotherham's industrial heritage and made some cannons that were actually used aboard ships in the Battle of Trafalgar. There is also a sarcophagus in the centre of this 3-tiered folly, although thankfully empty, as Charles was the only prime minister to be buried at York Minster, although the use of a sarcophagus and a cupola at top just shows that this folly was designed in all the classical styles that follies usually are built of. Inside of the Rockingham Mausoleum, there is a statue of the late second Marquess, crafted by Joseph Nollekins, as well as 8 busts of Charles's key political allies, including one of our old friend, Admiral Keppel. The Wentworth estates were now in the hands of the Fitzwilliams. Much like the Watson Wentworths, the Fitzwilliams gained a lot of their money through land ownership, as well as politics and industry. Also like the Watson Wentworths, they were renowned for being very kind owners. They often gave their workers food during hard times, built exceptional accommodation for their miners, and at Christmas invited local children and families onto their estates for presents and food. Make no mistake, however, they were no less extravagant. Trust me, these are some pretty wild people who threw some even wilder parties. That may be the understatement of the year. Let's take one example. In just one party in 1807, 600 guests, no less, were welcomed by a military band to a feast. The public were also treated to food outside, namely 12 roasted sheep and 2 roasted oxen. And that was just for the people outside. Like I say, they really did care about feeding and involving the local community. These parties, however, were mainly extravagant to try and impress political allies, to make connections, and to just demonstrate wealth and status. The feast inside, however, was even more staggering. It included, and this was just one party, mind you, 14 sheep and 3 lambs, 3 calves and 10 hams, 54 chickens, 240 bushels of flour were used in cooking, and 555 eggs were as well. But that's nothing compared to the alcohol. The alcohol alone could have probably killed a village. It included, and a reminder, this is just one party alone for not a small amount of people, but 600 people, 72 hogsheads of ale. Now, a hogshead is a type of measurement based on a barrel for the transport of goods. One hogshead usually equals about 419 pints. So at one party alone, they served over 30,000 pints of ale. This is some Project X level stuff. Alongside this, they also had 473 bottles of wine, not just glasses, bottles of wine, 23 gallons of rum, and 18 gallons of brandy. Trust me when I say, they really did not do parties by halves here, and this is just one example of a party. This was really just to showcase their extravagance and wealth, but also to show that they were really willing to impress and had the wealth and status and power to back up this impressiveness. In other parties, for example, in 1789, when impressing and welcoming the Prince of Wales, they had about 14 tons of food served at one party. So not only were they welcoming royalty and extremely impressive guests, they were also serving them a lot of good stuff. Before his death in 1833, this man, the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam, had amassed over 115,000 acres of land in Ireland and Yorkshire. Moreover, he had also built up his own industrial village of Elsica for his ironworks and collieries. I've actually done 2 documentaries and a lot of research on that village. It's a great Georgian village and it's often regarded as one of the first model villages in the UK. And if you ever do get the chance to visit Wentworth and Wentworth Woodhouse, I highly advise, in order to complete your exploration of the Fitzwilliam story, also paying a visit to Elsica. Speaking of which, he also had built another floor on the 2 wings of the house right there next to the portico to the entrance today. Thomas Watson Wentworth had changed the name to just Wentworth House in the early 1700s. By the mid-1820s, however, the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam had changed the name back to Wentworth Woodhouse. Despite a royal visit in 1912, with a crowd of over 25,000 people in attendance, Wentworth Woodhouse, however, was about to meet its downfall. During the Second World War, Wentworth Woodhouse was used as a base for the Intelligence Corps. Established in 1914, this branch of the military specialized in acquiring and analyzing vital information. They set up training camps in picturesque and noble settings, including one at the Woodhouse. A lot of homes, and especially Georgian mansions like this, were often used by the military during the Second World War for a variety of reasons. The intelligence corps were the ones who used Wentworth Woodhouse during the Second World War. The family at the time moved away, whilst the military stationed their troops in the stable blocks and their officers in the living quarters of the West Front. They even used motorcycles for training in Wentworth Park and conducted military exercises in the Marble Saloon. One of the soldiers to attend the Woodhouse was a military engineer called Justin Brooke, who served against the Soviet Union with the Finnish during the Winter War of 1939. The saloon also played host to physical education for college girls. From 1949 until 1979, Lady Mabel, who was sister to the Earl, who owned the Woodhouse at the time, used most of the house as a training facility for female PE teachers. Then, from 1979 until 1988, the house merged with Sheffield City Polytechnic, which is now Sheffield Hallam University. Here, they taught physical education as well as geography. More importantly than that, however, Wentworth Woodhouse saw a renewed lease of life as it became a hub for students. With the building of accommodation, laboratories, and even a student bar, the house was quite an enviable student experience. Interestingly, it was a stable block where most of this was built, although I'm fairly certain or fairly hopeful that they didn't try and get the horses drunk. Following the Second World War, however, Wentworth Woodhouse was ultimately to meet its downfall. The UK was in desperate need of coal following the war, which was one of the main causes for the nationalisation of the industry. The Fitzwilliams, who owned many local collieries, were forced to give up a great deal of their wealth in response to this decision to nationalise the industry. Even more unfortunate, however, was the fact that the Woodhouse was situated right atop the Barnsley Seam. In 1946, debates raged in Parliament concerning whether this coal should be mined, given it was underneath such a historic house and would severely damage it. The media, the Conservative Party, the locals, and even the miners themselves were all vehemently opposed to the open cast mining. For one, they argued, the damage it would do to one of Britain's finest homes was incalculable at the time. For two, Emmanuel Manny Shinwell, the Minister of Fuel and Power from 1945 until 1947, claimed the coal was of high quality and was in abundance. Yet there was not a scientific study to support this claim. Quite the opposite, in fact. A lot of speculation has been taken that he was saying this just to try and get at the coal-owning landed aristocracy, a group of people he was known to be opposed to. Despite this opposition and this lack of support for the open cast mining, the mining went ahead, and the Woodhouse was to endure 40 years of open cast mining. It was almost spiteful on Shinwell's behalf. The digging was done right up to the door of the West Front, and this is no exaggeration as the picture shows. If the Earl or Lady were to look out of their living quarters windows, they would be greeted with the top of a mound of dirt. This was to be the beginning of the end for the Fitzwilliams, but not the end of their hardship. They were an international family, as in 1904 the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam, also called William, was leading an expedition into the Cocos Islands in Central America in search of supposed treasure. He almost died in the process, as he was nearly caught in the blasting operations. 8 men actually did die, and they were never actually found any of their treasure. Their international connections did not stop there either, and even had connections with the Kennedys in America. Peter, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, found his marriage with Olive Obby Plunkett in shambles, with some believing it was due to her supposed alcoholism. Secretly, he had been romancing Kathleen Cavendish, also known as Kick Kennedy. As the surname may give away, she was indeed the sister of the famous US President, John F. Kennedy. Former ambassador to the UK for the USA, Kathleen was introduced to the Earl by Queen Elizabeth II in 1938, who was a princess at the time. She and the Earl planned to marry, even though it meant her family would disown her. Tragically, however, whilst on a flight to a Paris holiday in 1948, turbulence caused their plane to crash. All on board were killed instantly upon impact. The title of Earl, however, was soon to die out. Peter was without a son. Thus, in a rather strange leap, the peerage of earldom was passed on to his second cousin once removed, Eric Wentworth Fitzwilliam. Then, in 1952, with his death, the title was passed on to his second cousin, Tom Wentworth Fitzwilliam. Tom, as it was to turn out, was to be the 10th Earl Fitzwilliam, and the final ever to hold that title. In 1979, at 75 years old, Tom passed peacefully at Wentworth Woodhouse, and with him died the title Earl Fitzwilliam. The Woodhouse itself was in a state of emergency. It was in a state of disrepair by this year. Years of constant architectural change, subsidence damage from the mining, and a lack of finances coupled with heavy death duties had taken their toll on the mansion and the family that owned it. By 1989, the Fitzwilliams and the Polytechnic no longer needed the house. They separated, and after over 200 years, the Fitzwilliam dynasty left the house formally. Wentworth Woodhouse underwent a long and constant series of auctions being passed from hand to hand. Nearly 30 years later, however, despite all the hardship it went through in the 20th century, it finally saw new life. It was purchased for £7.6 million by the Wentworth Woodhouse Preservation Trust. Scaffolding was put up for years in order to restore the house, and they are still doing ongoing work in order to repair it and to make it as beautiful and as accessible and as great usage as it was all those years ago for the public to enjoy and love. The near 300-year-old house, whilst not near the end of its journey of being saved, had at least been snatched from the clutches of destruction. Wentworth Woodhouse is still going under expensive and serious renovation to preserve its story, and consider me biased, but I believe it's one of the most important stories in all of Yorkshire to preserve. It's now open to visitors for guided tours, showing that even after all this time, this Georgian masterpiece still captures people's hearts. My next step is including Wentworth Woodhouse in a book I am writing, and hopefully adapt into a documentary series about the best and most important historic homes of Yorkshire. This is a plan I am putting in motion and writing and putting together, and so if there is any interest in there, I'd be more than happy to share my ideas and stories with you. But thank you for listening to my talk about Wentworth Woodhouse, and if there's any questions, please let me know via email or by comment, and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, I encourage all who are watching to go and visit this marvellous Georgian mansion and really feel at home like the Watson Wentworths and the Fitzwilliams did all those years ago. Thanks for watching and thanks for listening.